She had a ring on her finger, a name she'd never spoken aloud, and a photograph of a man she had never met. But when she stepped off that train into the blazing Arizona sun, clutching her father's Bible against her chest, the man in the photograph was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was silence. A dusty platform, and a young Apache boy with black eyes and a wagon waiting at the edge of town, who looked at her like he already knew exactly who she was. She should have turned around. Every instinct she had, every prayer her father had ever taught her, told her to run. She didn't. And what happened next changed not just her life, but the fate of two peoples on the edge of war. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, a girl who left Missouri with nothing but grief and hope, and a man named Nantan Lobo, the Apache chief who sent for her not out of love but out of necessity. Neither of them expected what came after. The summer of 1874 did not arrive in Missouri. It descended like a punishment. Dust settled over the cornfields like a burial shroud. The sky burned white instead of blue. Rivers thinned to whispers. And the people of the Missouri plains, farmers, preachers, and their families began to disappear one by one, taken by cholera and hunger and the quiet cruelty of a land that had stopped giving. Reverend Whitmore had buried more neighbors than he had baptized that spring. He was a good man, not a perfect one, but the kind of good that holds a community together through sheer force of faith. He read scripture at every deathbed. He gave away the last of his grain. He prayed even when the prayers stopped coming back with answers. And then, one morning in June, it was his own name written in the church ledger. He died quietly, in the same small room where Clara had been born. No doctor came. There was none left to summon. No congregation gathered. Most had already scattered. There was only Clara, 19 years old, sitting beside his bed with his hand in hers until the hand went still. He left her three things: his worn leather Bible, a cracked china teacup her mother had treasured, and debts, heavy, pressing debts, to men whose patience had dried up along with everything else. She had no money, no land, no husband, no plan. In 1874, for a woman alone on the plains, that was not a problem. It was a sentence. Her Aunt Miriam arrived from St. Louis 2 weeks later, smelling of rosewater and practicality, fanning herself with a church bulletin like she was already bored by the tragedy of it all. "A girl alone cannot make a life out here," she announced, more statement than sympathy. "There's a paper in town, the Matrimonial Gazette. Honest men in the territories, settlers, ranchers, some lawmen, they pay the fare if you agree to marry." Clara stared at her. "You want me to marry a stranger?" Miriam didn't blink. "I want you to survive." That evening, Clara sat at her father's desk, the one he'd used to write his sermons, and read the notices by candlelight. Names, numbers, territories. Men reduced to paragraphs. Most sounded lonely. A few sounded desperate. One made her pause. Honest man of 30 seeks God-fearing bride to share ranching life in Arizona territory. Faith and fortitude required. Write to Samuel Crow, San Miguel. The name sounded like something solid, like a fence post driven deep into reliable ground. She wrote him a careful letter, her best handwriting, her most honest words. She told him about her father, about Missouri, about the little she had to offer and the much she was willing to learn. She sealed it without expecting a reply. A fortnight later, an envelope arrived. Inside, a train ticket, a simple iron ring, and a single line written in a steady hand. "I will meet you at the station. Come as you are." She packed everything she owned into one carpet bag. She tied her father's Bible with a blue ribbon. She did not cry. She had already spent her tears. On the morning she left, She stood at the Missouri station while the locomotive breathed steam into the pale sky and thought, "This is the last of one life. Whatever comes next, it begins here." Westward, the conductor called. She stepped aboard. The journey lasted 6 days. Each one peeled away something familiar. Green fields gave way to golden prairie. Prairie gave way to brown scrubland. Scrubland gave way to a world Clara had no words for. Vast red mesas rising like ancient cathedrals from the earth. The sky enormous and unforgiving. The air so dry it cracked her lips by the second day. Other passengers watched her with quiet curiosity. A girl traveling alone under a marriage promise. There was a whole story in that. She didn't offer it. She slept in short stretches. When she dreamed of a man. Tall, fair-haired, gentle-voiced. A man who would shake her hand at the station and say, "You must be Clara," with a warm and steady smile. She held tight to that dream. It was all she had. When the train finally hissed to a stop at San Miguel Station, the world outside the window stole her breath. Not because it was beautiful, though it was in its strange and merciless way, but because it was utterly unlike anything she had ever known. Red Canyon walls, dust the color of rust, a silence so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. She stepped down onto the platform in her pale blue dress, gripping the photograph she'd been sent. A faded image of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, a mustache, the ghost of a smile, and scanned every face in sight. No one matched. It was the sheriff who approached her. A broad man, weathered, uncomfortable, the look of someone delivering news he hadn't asked to carry. "Miss Whitmore?" He removed his hat. "There's a man waiting for you." "Outside of town." "My fiancé," she said carefully. "Samuel Crow?" The sheriff paused just a half-second too long. "He goes by that name, yes." He glanced away. "He's not quite what most folks around here would call a settler, but I've known him going on 4 years. He's a decent man." A cold trickle moved down the back of her neck. "What do you mean, not what most would call—" "You'll see," the sheriff said quietly. "The wagon's waiting." The wagon was drawn by 2 lean Mustangs. The driver was a boy, no more than 14, Apache, with black hair bound back with leather cord. He looked at her without expression, said nothing, and gestured for her to climb in. She should have asked more questions. She asked none. Something in the boy's calm made questions feel foolish. They rode west into the desert as the afternoon light turned amber, then copper, then deep burning red. The town disappeared. The road disappeared. There was only open land and the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere far above. When she saw the smoke, she thought at first it was a ranch house, a chimney, cook fire. Then the smoke multiplied, and the shapes below it weren't buildings, they were lodges, Apache lodges, arranged in the curve of a canyon valley, firelight flickering between them like scattered stars. Her hands gripped the seat. "Where are we?" she asked. The boy said without turning, "Nantan Lobo." The name meant nothing to her then. It would mean everything soon. As the wagon rolled into the camp, warriors rose from their fires. They were quiet, watchful, their eyes carrying the particular weight of men who had learned to measure every stranger in an instant. Children pressed close to their mothers. An old woman stared at Clara with frank appraisal, arms crossed. Clara held herself perfectly still. If she moved wrong, she felt, the whole world might crack. Then one man stepped forward from the rest, and she knew, without being told, that this was him. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with a long diagonal scar running down one cheek like a river on a map. His hair was dark, worn long and bound with copper beads. He wore no hat. He carried no weapon she could see, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds, calm as deep water, moved to her face and held there with an attention so complete it felt almost like a physical thing. He spoke quietly. His English was deliberate, precise, the English of a man who had learned it as a strategy, not a birthright. "You are Clara Whitmore," she swallowed. "I came to marry Samuel Crow," a single, unhurried nod. "That is my name among your people." The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. She heard her own voice from somewhere far away. You deceived me." His gaze didn't flicker. "The letter was written by my interpreter. We made no false promises about the life you would find here. Only the name was adjusted. She tasted the bitterness of the word. "You knew I would never have come if I had known—" "Yes," he said, simply, without apology. "I knew. Then why? Why do this at all?" He looked at her, truly looked, the way few people ever do. And when he spoke, his voice was as even as the desert horizon, because a treaty between my people and the white settlers is collapsing. Because blood has already been spilled on both sides. Because the whites do not trust what they cannot understand. And a chief who takes a white wife becomes to them something less fearful. Something human. A pause. "I did not deceive you to shame you, Clara Whitmore. I did it because I am trying to stop a war." Silence lay between them like distance. "And what of my life?" she whispered. "What becomes of me in this arrangement?" Something shifted in his expression then. Something smaller and quieter than anything she'd seen in him yet. "You are free to choose," he said. "I will not force this. But if you leave, the treaty fails. More people die, mine and yours both. And if you stay," he paused, "I will give you my word before my elders and your God that I will honor you as my wife in every way that honor requires." Clara stood very still while the firelight flickered around her and the stars began, appearing one by one in the enormous Arizona sky. Her father's voice came to her then, not words exactly, just the memory of his steadiness. His belief that the hardest choices were rarely between right and wrong, but between two rights that cost everything. She looked at this man, this stranger, this unexpected fate, and she stayed. The ceremony was unlike any she had imagined for herself. Apache elders spoke words she couldn't follow in a language old as the canyon walls. The sheriff and two settlers stood as witnesses, their expressions somewhere between solemn and bewildered. Clara wore her pale blue dress and held her father's Bible, because it was the only solid thing she had to hold on to. Nantan Lobo stood beside her and did not touch her once. He spoke his vows in Apache first, then repeated a version in English that the interpreter translated in a low murmur. His voice was steady throughout. She noticed his hands were still. When it was over, he placed one hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, and said, "From this day, you are called White Dove. My people will protect you." That night, she sat alone by the fire while the desert cooled and the stars blazed overhead with a density she'd never seen in Missouri. The drums played somewhere deeper in the camp, rhythmic and unhurried, the heartbeat of a people she did not yet know. Her husband approached quietly, as he seemed to do everything. He set a bundle before her without ceremony, a small wooden box, its surface carved with interlocking geometric patterns she couldn't read. "A wedding gift," he said. She reached out and tried the latch. Locked. "What's inside?" For the first time, the faintest trace of a smile appeared in the corner of his mouth. "You will know when the time is right." Then he turned and walked back toward the larger fires, leaving her alone with the locked box and the wide, wild sky. She held it for a long time, feeling the weight of the unknown in her hands. And somewhere in the firelight, in the strange music of a world she hadn't chosen, something small and stubborn shifted inside her chest. Not peace. Not yet. But the first hairline crack in the wall between fear and possibility. The dawn after her wedding rose in shades of fire, red and copper and the faintest edge of gold, painting the canyon walls so vividly that Clara sat outside her lodge and simply stared, forgetting for a moment that she was anywhere she hadn't meant to be. Nantan was already gone when she woke. Only his folded blanket remained beside hers, a small, deliberate courtesy that somehow said more than words. When he returned, he carried a basin of cool water and a blanket embroidered with intricate patterns in red and ochre and black. "The day will be hot," he said. "You should wash." He set the basin down without looking directly at her, a quiet privacy she hadn't expected, then straightened and spoke again. "You will meet the people today. Some will not welcome you. Do not take their suspicion as insult. They have earned the right to distrust strangers. Walk with respect, and they will see you in time." "I don't belong here," she said. He met her eyes evenly. "Neither did my mother," she frowned. "Your mother?" A pause. "The kind that carries the weight of old grief." She was half white. "Brought to our people from a settlement near Tucson when she was a girl." His voice didn't break. It simply grew quieter, the way deep water goes still before a drop. She stayed. She learned the old ways. When she died, the elders said her spirit rides with the hawks. His gaze moved briefly to the sky, then back. "Belonging is not something you are born with, Clara Whitmore. It is something you build, with your hands and your choices and your years." She had no answer for that, but she remembered it. In the days that followed, she learned. She learned the shape of the Apache morning, how it began with fire and water and quiet movement, with the older women directing the younger ones in a language of gestures as much as words. She learned to carry water from the river without spilling, to mend hides with a needle made of bone, to tell the edible plants from the poisonous ones by their smell alone. She made mistakes. She committed small, unintentional offenses she didn't know were offenses until an elder woman corrected her with a sharp click of her tongue. She ate the wrong things, sat in the wrong places, moved too fast or too slow, but she kept trying, and slowly, the eyes that watched her began to change. Wariness softened to attention. Attention softened to something approaching tolerance. Nantan's brother Tossa watched her most carefully of all, arms crossed, expression locked as a winter sky. She did not try to win him. She simply worked, day after day, at the edge of whatever circle she had earned access to. The children were the first to trust her. They always are. One morning, a small girl followed her to the river at a careful distance. Clara pretended not to notice. By the time she reached the water, the girl was walking beside her. By the time they returned to camp, they were walking together, and the child was learning her first English words: river, sun, basket, bird, and dissolving into giggles at Clara's attempts at Apache. Where one child led, others followed. Within 2 weeks, Clara had a small, devoted class that gathered near her lodge in the evenings. She taught them English sounds, and they taught her Apache words in return, and the trade seemed roughly even in their eyes. Nantan watched this from a distance. He said nothing, but she caught the expression on his face once, just once, a quiet, private satisfaction he hadn't meant to show. It vanished the moment he realized she'd seen it, replaced by his usual composed regard. But she'd seen it, and she kept it. Their evenings were careful, measured things. Nantan never pressed her. They slept in the same lodge. Necessity and propriety demanded it, but with the quiet understanding of two people navigating a shared geography without a shared map. He rose before dawn. He returned after dark. When they spoke, it was about practical things: the day's work, the weather, the movements of people and animals in the valley. But sometimes, in the soft territory between business and sleep, the walls lowered a little. "Tell me about Missouri," he said one evening. Sitting at the fire while she braided a length of leather cord, she told him about the green of it, how green everything was after rain, the way the whole world seemed to exhale. About her father's church, small and white-painted, smelling of cedar and old hymn books. About the Missouri River in flood season, brown and enormous and terrifying and magnificent. He listened with the completeness of someone who rarely wasted attention. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I miss who I was there," she said finally. "The girl who knew what everything meant. Here, I have to learn meaning all over again." A pause. "Do you think that's a loss? Or a beginning?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother used to say that the desert breaks everyone who comes to it unprepared. But those who come ready to be remade, it makes them into something the green lands never could." She looked at him across the fire. "Do you think I'm being remade?" His eyes, those storm-gray, serious, unexpectedly deep eyes, held hers. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are becoming someone you haven't met yet." She didn't know why that felt like the most important thing anyone had ever said to her. His name was Colonel Arthur Fletcher, a man who had built his reputation on conflict the way other men built houses. Brick by careful brick. He had arrived in the territory months before Clara, riding the wave of land speculation that followed every weakening treaty. He needed the Apache land. He needed the Apache gone. And the one thing standing in his way was a peace agreement that refused to fully die. Held in place, people said, by a strange marriage between a chief and a Missouri preacher's daughter. Fletcher could not abide it. He began with words, in the San Miguel saloon, at ranchers' meetings, in letters to the territorial governor. He painted Nantan Lobo as a savage who had kidnapped a white woman, forced her into a heathen marriage, was holding her against her will. He made Clara into a victim. It was a useful story. It was entirely false. Clara heard about it from the sheriff, who rode out to the camp one afternoon wearing the expression of a man carrying an unpleasant obligation. "There's talk," he said to Nantan, with Clara standing beside him. "Fletcher's riling up the ranchers. He's saying the lady is here against her will, that you've taken her." He glanced at Clara with something like apology. "People want to see for themselves that this is—" "I'm exactly where I choose to be," Clara said. The sheriff exhaled. "I believe you, Mom. But Fletcher's the kind of man who doesn't let the truth slow him down. He'll push until someone does something foolish." He was right. 3 weeks later, Fletcher arrived at the edge of the Apache camp with 9 armed men and the language of false rescue. "Release the woman," he called across the clearing, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been told no and meant it. "Let her come out peaceably, and there need be no trouble here." Clara stepped out of the lodge herself. Not summoned, not led, not pushed. She walked into the open with her spine straight and her father's steadiness gathered in her chest like a stone. "I am not a prisoner," she said, loudly enough that every man with Fletcher could hear. "I am Nantan Lobo's wife by my own choice and my own word. And any man who rides onto this land claiming otherwise is either a liar, a coward, or both." Fletcher's jaw tightened. His horse shifted beneath him. "Girl," he said, with the particular contempt of a man whose strategy has just been ruined. "You don't know what you're—" "I know exactly what I'm saying." She moved to stand directly in front of Nantan, not behind him, not beside him, but in front, between her husband and the line of rifles. "If you want to reach my husband, Colonel, you'll go through me first." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Not one of Fletcher's men moved. Some of them looked at each other. A few looked at the ground. They had come for a rescue. What they found instead was a woman who didn't need one, and that somehow was a thing none of them had prepared for. Fletcher left. He didn't leave quietly. He made promises, dark ones, the kind that arrive later in the night rather than the daylight. But he left. And as the sound of his horses faded into the canyon, Nantan Lobo turned to Clara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not gratitude. Something older and quieter than gratitude. Something that looked, she thought, almost like wonder. "You did not have to do that," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Neither did you, when you offered me the choice to leave." A long moment passed between them, the kind that doesn't need words to say what it says. Fletcher was not a man who accepted defeat cleanly. He came back a fortnight later, not with a speech this time, but with fire. The attack came at the edge of dawn, when the camp was only beginning to stir, when even the horses were still half asleep. Fletcher's men rode hard out of the canyon shadow with torches and rifles and the particular madness of men who have convinced themselves that what they are doing is righteous. The camp erupted. Clara ran, not away from the fighting, but toward the center of it, where she'd heard the loudest shot. She found Nantan in the clearing with a wound in his shoulder, blood soaking down his arm, still standing, still directing his warriors with the controlled authority of a man who refuses to fall. She went to him without thinking. Later, she would not be able to explain the moment. There was no fear in it, which seemed impossible and yet was completely true. There was only clarity, the terrible focused simplicity of a person who knows exactly what matters and moves toward it. She got her shoulder under his arm. She kept them both upright. The battle ended the way such things do, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Fletcher's men scattered when it became clear that the Apache warriors knew this canyon in the dark in ways no outsider ever could. 3 of Fletcher's riders were captured. The rest fled. Fletcher himself disappeared into the desert without his horse, and the sheriff's men found him 2 days later. Dehydrated and furious and considerably diminished, he was escorted to the territorial border and advised, in terms that left no room for interpretation, not to return. That night, Nantan's shoulder was cleaned and bound by the elder women of the camp. Clara sat beside him throughout. She had refused to leave, and the elder women, after one long, appraising look, had said nothing further about it. When the lodge was quiet and the others had gone, Nantan turned his head toward her. His face, always so composed, was hollowed by pain and something else, something more vulnerable that the pain had temporarily stripped. "Bear, you could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she replied. "That is my burden to carry." She looked at him directly. "Not anymore." A silence. The fire had burned very low. "White Dove," he said, the name his people had given her. The one that had felt foreign and imposed in the beginning, but now she realized, felt simply like her own. Nantan. "I did not send for you expecting this." His voice was careful, quiet, every word selected. "I sent for you as a strategy. A practical arrangement, a weight on one side of a scale." He paused. "I did not expect—" "What?" she asked softly. He looked at her, fully, without his usual reserve, without the distance he'd maintained like armor. "I did not expect to find someone worth fighting beside," he said. "Not behind me, not in front of me, beside me. As an equal." The fire crackled softly. Outside, a canyon wind moved through the rocks with a low, searching sound. The desert breathing. "Neither did I," she said. "But here we are." Nantan healed slowly. The wound was deep, but his body was strong and his will was stronger, and while he healed, the world around them, as if taking its cue from his recovery, slowly began to mend as well. Word of Clara's stand had reached the towns. A white woman who stepped between Apache warriors and armed riders, who called Fletcher's lies out in front of his own men, who wore the crimson and gold sash of an Apache wife with her spine straight and her chin up. That story traveled far, and it did not travel quietly. It softened things. Not everything, not quickly, but in the small, persistent ways that matter. A rancher's wife defending the Apache people at a town meeting. A young settler who'd been ready to ride with Fletcher putting down his rifle and going home. The sheriff came riding to the camp again in early spring, this time without an escort. He dismounted, removed his hat, and stood with the honest discomfort of a man trying to do the right thing and not entirely sure how. "We've drawn up new trade terms," he said to Nantan. "Safe passage to town for your people. Fair price for your horses. An end to the raid cycle from both sides." He paused, something working in his face. "I reckon it's past time we stop bleeding each other dry." Nantan studied him for a long moment. Then he offered his hand. "And your people will have safe passage here," he said. "No blood for blood." They shook hands in the canyon light while Clara watched. And she thought of her father, of his belief, weathered and tested and ultimately unshaken, that even the hardest ground could yield if you were patient enough to keep planting. He would have loved this desert, she thought. He would have understood it. That evening, Nantan found her at the edge of the canyon cliff where they had come to sit, the two of them. When the day was over and the talking was done, the place where the desert opened up below like something enormous and honest and without pretense. He sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into the pouch at his side and drew out something small, which he set in her palm without preamble. It was a pendant, silver, roughly shaped, unmistakably a bird in flight. Its surface was uneven and warm, bearing the marks of hands that had worked it with care rather than tools. She turned it over, puzzling at it. "It's beautiful," she said. "But what is it made from?" "It looks like—" She stopped. The texture. The weight. The particular curve of the metal. Nantan. "This is the lock from my wedding box." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, you melted it." "Yes." She looked up at him. "Why?" He met her eyes in the fading desert light, amber and bronze pooling in the planes of his face, his scar silver in the dusk. "Because locks keep hearts closed," he said quietly, "and yours opened mine." The words arrived in her chest like the first rain after a long drought. She looked down at the pendant in her hands, this small, imperfect, irreplaceable thing, and felt the weight of it in every possible sense. A wedding gift she couldn't open, a lock that had become a bird. A man who had started with strategy and arrived by some long and unexpected road at something true. "What do I give in return?" she whispered. He reached over and closed her fingers gently around the pendant. "You already gave it," he said, "when you stayed." The storm came that same night. Rain was rare in the Arizona desert. When it arrived as an event. The sky darkening from the east, thunder rolling through the canyon passes like a slow drumbeat, the smell of water on hot stone rising up to meet it. The kind of rain that the land receives not as weather but as blessing. The tribe came out of their lodges to stand in it. Men lifted their faces to the sky. Women sang, not the songs of ceremony but the older songs, the ones that remembered the land before drought, before conflict, before the long diminishment of things. Children ran barefoot in the red mud, laughing in the absolute unself-conscious way that only children in storms can manage together, Clara, stood among them with the silver bird around her neck and the rain soaking through her dress, and her hair and the last careful distance she'd been maintaining, and laughed, openly, fully, without reservation. She laughed because she was wet and muddy and alive in the Arizona desert in the middle of a rainstorm. She laughed because she had come here with nothing but grief and a carpet bag and a letter from a stranger, and somehow, she had found herself standing in the middle of something real, something larger than herself, something that asked more of her than she thought she had to give and had received it anyway. She felt Nantan's hand close over hers. She didn't look at him. She just held on. The celebration held that spring was unlike anything the Arizona Territory had witnessed. Fires blazed across the valley. Drums echoed off the canyon walls until the sound seemed to come from the earth itself. White settlers and Apache people sat side by side for the first time, not without awkwardness, not without the careful awareness of everything that lay between them, but present, willing, sharing the same firelight and the same night sky. Clara wore the crimson and gold sash across her shoulder. The silver bird rested against her collarbone. She watched the two worlds she now inhabited overlap for the first time, and felt something enormous settle inside her. Tossa found her near the edge of the firelight. Nantan's brother, who had watched her with crossed arms and winter sky expressions through all her months of learning. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. Then, "White Dove has fire in her heart," he said gruffly. "She rides beside the chief." Not behind him. He walked away before she could respond. It was, she understood, the highest compliment he knew how to offer. When Nantan took her hand and led her to stand before the gathered people, both peoples. In the firelight, a hush fell over the valley. He raised his voice so all could hear. "Once I took a wife for peace," he said. "I believed that duty could be stronger than love, that a treaty needed a symbol and a symbol was sufficient. I was wrong." His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man saying something he had considered carefully and meant completely. This woman came to the desert with nothing but courage and a Bible and a willingness to see. She did not only survive here, she built something here. She stood between her husband and a man's rifle. She taught our children their first English words. She became, by every measure that matters, one of us. He turned to look at her then. Those storm-gray eyes warm in the firelight. That quiet, unstoppable steadiness she had come to love as much as any single thing she knew. "Clara Whitmore of Missouri," he said. "White Dove who rides with fire. Will you stand with me again, not as a bride of treaty, but as a wife of choice?" The whole world seemed to hold still. She looked at him, this man she had feared and resisted, and worked alongside and argued with and come to trust in the slow and absolute way that desert things require. This man whose mother had found belonging in an unexpected world. This man who had melted a lock into a bird because he understood. Somewhere in the deep wordless place where people understand things without deciding to. That she had opened something in him that had been closed for a very long time. She thought of Missouri, of green fields and her father's voice and everything she'd lost in that cruel summer of 1874. She thought of the 6-day train, journey into the unknown, and the boy with the wagon and the warrior, who had not forced her hand. She thought of rain, on her face and a silver pendant warm, against her skin. "I will," she said. The sound that rose around them, Apache voices and settler voices weaving together in the firelight, was unlike anything Clara had heard before. Not a cheer exactly, something older, something that didn't need a name. Later, when the fires burned low and the stars were thick and heavy in the black Arizona sky, they walked together to the canyon's edge. The desert below stretched out in all its enormous, indifferent, somehow tender immensity. A river glinted silver far in the distance. The air smelled of smoke and rain and mesquite and the particular sharpness of high desert dark. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked softly. "The letter. Sending for me the way you did." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through his hair. "Only that I did not send it sooner," he said. She leaned into him, her head finding the place between his shoulder and his chest where it fit as if it had always been meant to be there. His arm came around her, unhurried, certain. Below them, the desert breathed. She thought about the women in her father's congregation who had married for love and suffered for practicality. She thought about the men in the matrimonial gazette who had reduced their whole lives to one paragraph. She thought about how she had come west, looking for safety, and found instead something far more dangerous and far more necessary: the specific, irreversible risk of becoming someone new. She had not been led here by desperation. She understood now. She had been led here by the part of her that was already, quietly, ready to be remade. "We both found what we were meant to," she said. The wind stirred the sand below into slow, shifting shapes, the desert's way of writing what it knew. And Clara Whitmore, who had stepped off a train in a pale blue dress with a locked box and a stranger's iron ring, and no map whatsoever for what came next. Clara Whitmore, who was also White Dove, who rode beside her husband and not behind him, felt the last of her old life settle into the earth beneath her feet. Not lost, planted. The way her father had always said the most important things were not gone, not ended, but given to the ground so that something larger could grow. And in the language of that wide, star-crowded sky, with the desert wind carrying its ancient and unhurried music through the canyon below. That was exactly what it felt like. A beginning.